nalazimo se u situaciju kako se recimo nalazila Njemačka početkom 60. godina, u pokušaju, kako je rekao veliki Heinrich Böll, da zaboravimo prije nego što smo se sjetili. Dakle, da se stavi u drugi plan sve što je bilo u tim vremenima, ružnim, teškim vremenima, i da se kaže dajte da se bavimo normalnošću. To više što sad sa ovom pandemijom imamo još dodatnih problema da se vraćamo u normalnost i to još više utječe na taj pokušaj da se ovo zaboravi. Ako se o zločinima govori se uvijek u istoj formuli na svim stranama. Bilo je zločina na našoj strani, ali to su bili pojedinačni zločini. Na njihovoj strani je to bio sistem ili sustav, kako hoćete. Dakle, kod nas su to bili sporadični ispadi, ljudi koji su poludjeli, ne znam šta je s njima bilo, ispali iz kontrole. Na njihovoj strani je bio sistem ili sustav. I to se ponavlja doslovce istim riječima na svim stranama, u kojima onda naprosto nema svijesti o kolektivnoj krivici. 1946. je Jaspers napisao knjižicu o pojmu krivice. Dakle, godinu dana nakon rata, nije važno koliko vremena od onda prošlo, ali godinu dana nakon rata je postavio to jasnu razliku između krivice i odgovornosti. Mi nikako ne možemo doći do koncepta kolektivne odgovornosti za neke stvari koje su se dogodile, tako da bi se ta odgovornost prihvatila makar i frazama. Ovo što je kolegica Tee Gorjanc spomenula je istina u Hrvatskoj došlo do vidjela u naznakama. Doista se pokušalo reći pa da, eto, bilo je žrtava na drugoj strani i to nakon eto koliko godina i to je sigurno nekakav pomak. Međutim, taj pomak je još uvijek simboličke naravi i još uvijek rezerviran za veoma uski krug političkih vođa, koji to dobrim dijelom rade zato što je parlamentarna situacija takva da bez Srpske demokratske stranke nemaju većine, da budemo sasvim na čistu i da se demistificiraju neke velike riječi. I to opet, da se na koncu vrati na početak, zajednicu dovodi u situaciju da se nije promijenio koncept pravednosti, da se dogodilo to kao i u Njemačkoj u 60. godinama, da su odsječeni ekstremi, dakle više ne prihvaćamo klanje, da imamo, što bi rekao Krleža, domobrane bez ustaše. Dakle, domobrani su bili oni koji su rekli ustaše doista pretjeruju u klanju, ali ipak su to naši dečki, treba ih razumjeti. To je neka vrsta atmosfere koju danas imamo na svim stranama, tu domobransku atmosferu. Nismo za zločin, osuđujemo zločine, ali treba razumjeti zašto su se naši ljudi našli u takvoj situaciji i ipak ih drugčije gledati. Dokle god to imamo, vraćam se još s tom jednom rečenicom na početak, sudovi neće pomoći po mojim sudu, iako je dobro da rade svoj posao. Ja mislim da je njihov posao uglavnom završen, to jest uopće nije završen, ali će prestati. I pitanje samo može li se politički i obrazovno u javnosti, pa onda medijski nešto učiniti, a ovo ostalo će ostati po mom sudu u arhivima.
Ja se izvinjavam. Dakle, da li mislite da je izborom predsjednika Milanovića su sada promenjene prilike u Hrvatskoj dovoljno da se može ponovo razgovarati o podršci i osnivanju Rekoma?
Nema govora o tomu da bi se bilo što pozitivno dogodilo izborom predsjednika Milanovića. On se ponaša, već sam to javno rekao, kao nezakoniti politički sin Franje Tuđmana. On se okrenuo odmah nakon izbora veoma radikalno na suverenističku stranu, doveo Hrvatsku u situaciju ružnih sporova sa Bosnom i Hercegovinom i on je čovjek koji je zabranio socijaldemokratskoj stranci, partiji prije 5 godina, potpisivanje peticije za Rekom. Kad su mnogi aktivisti to htjeli, on je doslovce na sastanku zabranio potpisivanje. Dakle, nažalost od njega ne možemo ništa očekivati, nažalost od Plenkovića možemo manje ne očekivati, da ne kažem više očekivati nego od njega.
Hvala vam na tom podsjećanju. Vi ste govorili o ipak simbolički važnim iskoracima iz Hrvatske, a profesorka Sabina Čehajić Clancy, koja se upravo bavi socijalnom psihologijom na Univerzitetu u Štokholmu, bavi se zapravo psihološkim procesima u grupama ljudi u konfliktnim, teškim, komplikovanim situacijama poput ovih naših na Balkanu. I ona će nam sada govoriti o javnom, kolektivnom izvinjenju, zapravo kao obliku reparacija za žrtve i njegovom značaju za proces pomirenja. Izvolite, Sabina, hvala vam što ste sa nama.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you, everybody. Yes, as correctly introduced, I'm going to speak about this particular relationship, non-judicial part, so to speak, of transitional justice, which is the relationship between, that is so often thought about and intuitively assumed, that specific political and collective apologies and specific programs and of reparation offers and compensations for the victims could facilitate in some way the process of reconciliation. And this is a particular question that we have aimed to examine through research, through empirical research that we have been conducting mainly, I have to say, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so in post-conflict context of Bosnia, so not broader region per se, but nevertheless, we have worked with thousands of second generation descendants, so to speak, of direct victims of war. And we have aimed to examine and understand how would the victim group members, so to speak, how would those who have been either directly or indirectly victimized through their previous parents' generations, how would they perceive and receive potential offers of apologies and specific reparations. And this is where I would just like to share some of our research that we have come to. And just a note, this research has been done over the course of 10 years. This is covering the period between 2008 and 2018. And before I just give you a little snapshot on what we have found in our research, just to give you again an empirical, so to speak, understanding and conceptualization of what we mean by reconciliation and how we have actually measured the process or coming closer to this desired final outcome that we all call, reconciliation. And this is really the way we are understanding this is through these two big pillars that has already been mentioned of acknowledgement and acceptance of moral responsibility for moral and human rights violations that have occurred in the past. So this is an important pillar, so to speak, of what we understand by reconciliation process. And the other important pillar that is not often mentioned, but seems to be an extremely important aspect of the transitional justice process, particularly when understood from more citizens or community perspective, is the process of forgiveness. And the process of forgiveness is understood and conceptualized mainly as an emotion regulation process. And this is where the psychology or social psychological perspective could be very useful when thinking about these processes, because it is in a way giving up an emotional right to revenge. And we are trying to understand what are the ways of getting closer to this acceptance of responsibility and closer to this, what we then call intergroup forgiveness. And in this way, we have examined different forms and different programs of apologies and reparation, and we wanted to see what is the most effective. And by effective, we precisely mean what form of an apology and what form of reparation would be most effective in facilitating the levels or increasing the levels of acknowledgement and of moral responsibility and forgiveness as another important aspect of sustainable, emotionally sustainable reconciliation. And here we have found that simple apologies communicated in a verbal way, as important as they might seem, are completely ineffective. So we have found that, and I just want to be very careful here. I do not wish to advocate that apologies are not important, because they can indeed be important, but it really depends on what we mean by it and what is really the content and the implication of such apologies. But when we just tested, and this was all experimental program that we have designed and completed across range of high schools and universities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we found that simple words of apologizing for either specific atrocities in post-conflict Bosnia or general human rights violations have not pushed forward in a positive sense any reconciliation process that how we have defined it. However, apologies that have contained in themselves an explicit acknowledgement of what is one apologizing for. So a general or generic apologies do not work. A specific acknowledgement and acceptance of what is being apologized for, and reparation offers, and very specific reparation programs and reparation offers are what we have designed to be an effective or more effective apology that then pushes people more towards these pro-social, or how we call it, reconciliation inductive processes in that sense. And we have tried to understand what is it really that didn't make the simple apology or verbal apology, so verbal expression, ineffective. And here we have done a range of interviews with victims and victim group members and focus group discussions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very empirical investigation. And people basically perceived it as a cheap way out, as an easy way and a cheap way out of the moral burden that has been basically left upon the societies to deal with. And this was something that was, to be honest, it came as a surprise to us, because we really have assumed and believed that they could and are indeed an important aspect and element of transitional justice processes. And another just note where I would just like to briefly mention it, and we can have a discussion if we wish, is this question of collective guilt and shame as emotional. So we are understanding this as an emotional consequence that can occur once people acknowledge the atrocities that have been committed by their own group, so not directly by themselves, but this is a kind of a group grounded or social identity group based founded emotional response. It does not necessarily stem from personal responsibility aspects, but more from the social and collective kind of line of responsibility definition. And these emotions can occur, and we have measured them, and we have observed them among young people across the country. Of course, they are not. They assume a certain level of acceptance and acknowledgement of responsibility, but they indeed do happen, and people indeed do feel them and carry them around. Sometimes they're very visible and expressive. Sometimes they're more psychologically hidden emotional sentiments that people don't necessarily verbalize and express as such. And we have measured how important are they, or can they be important at all, for intergroup relations and for facilitating intergroup reconciliation processes. And we did find that both emotions of guilt and shame, that people who feel those emotions are more bigger advocates, so to speak, of reparation policies and endorsement of specific reparation programs, and are those who are less likely to endorse what Professor Žarko has mentioned, this victimhood sentiment and this victimhood narrative is less likely to be prevalent in the psyche and in the mind of people who carry these emotions. However, we also examined how do victims perceive those who express these emotions. Will the victims engage in some form of rehumanization or some form of forgiveness or contact intentional kind of behavioral forms? And there we have found again, we have to be very careful and take the timeline in perspective as well, where we are as former Yugoslavia in this process. There we have found that they're not as effective when expressed, because victims are still not ready in some sense to kind of feel sorry. Let's put it in a very simple way. Victim group members are still not ready to feel any form of empathy or any form of sympathy, mildly speaking, for those who come from the other side, and guilt and shame is something as an immoral emotion or a moral expression of moral burden. And this is something where victim group members are sort of still not ready to deal with in that sense. But feeling those emotions and expressing those emotions seem to be different, or seem to be driving different processes. So here we also have to be careful when concluding what is effective, right, or not at this point of time when we speak about intergroup reconciliation.
Hvala vam. Mene zanima da li, nisam razumela, moram da priznam, da li ste se vi u istraživanju bavili odjekom koji su imale neka konkretna izvinjenja u Bosni i Hercegovini? Da li ste vi razmatrali kako su grupe reagovale na neka konkretna izvinjenja i ako da, koja? Mislim da bi nam to bilo korisno da se podsjetimo ili da naučimo. I još jedno pitanje. Ja znam da ste vi proučavali javna izvinjenja koje su upućivali Willy Brandt, Nelson Mandela, Jeljcin, ne znam, ja lično ne znam zašto sam i kako on izvinio, bilo bi korisno možda i to da se podsjetimo i naučimo. Obama, pa da li možete možda da ih uporedite sa izvinjenjima u javnom prostoru ovog našeg regiona koji smo imali da čujemo, koji su izdržavali nekih od predsjednika i premijera, Đukanović, na primjer, Tadić, Josipović, neki gestovi kao što je Vučićeva poseta Potočarima i kao što su ovi gestovi koje smo imali prilike da vidimo u Hrvatskoj prilikom obeležavanja godišnjice Oluje i prisustvovanja komemoracijama žrtava koji su i srpskog etničkog porekla. I na kraju, mislim, recite nam konkretno da li nešto od toga vidite kao baš dobar primer i koliko od ovih drugih primjera koje sam pomenula u regionu ima koristi, ima li je uopšte ili nema nikakve, kako vi to vidite? Hvala.
It's hard to answer this question for so many reasons. First of all, unfortunately, in the context, I'm speaking of the context of post-conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I guess we can also extend this beyond Bosnia to the region of the Western Balkans. They were the apologies that did take place. First of all, there were very few of those specific collective political apologies, but those that did take place and those that we have examined in terms of its effects were extremely ineffective. A particular apology that we have examined was a long-time apology that was given and offered by Dragan Čavić in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina and in reference to the genocide in Srebrenica that has occurred in 1995. And we have presented in this particular study Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims descendants from eastern Bosnia, and basically wanted to examine their responses to receiving this particular apology. And it's a big question here. What are we measuring? Are we measuring victims' satisfaction with an apology? Are we measuring victims' level of forgiveness or openness towards the former enemy group? What are we measuring? You know, it's also very, very important when we speak about the effects and efficiency of apology. In general, what we have found, and not just our work of research, but also other researchers and other scholars in other contexts. You know, you mentioned Obama apology that has been recently given in Australia for mistreatment of the ascendants of indigenous communities in Australia. Apologies that have been recently given in Northern Ireland by the Catholic Church, mistreatment of children, etc. There's a lot of instances and cases of where apologies have indeed been offered for specific human rights violations in different contexts. in general, they don't seem to assist this process of reconciliation, right? This does not mean that they're not important. This does not mean that they should not be delivered. This only means that they're not enough. That only means that offer of specific collective apologies are not enough when we think about sustainable reparation of intergroup trust, of intergroup relations. We need much more than just simple expressions of I'm sorry or we are sorry. We deeply regret what has happened. So this is important, but it's only a first step in this line of what do we need, or what is an effective response, so to speak, an effective psychological almost, right? An emotional response to when we speak about history of collective and moral atrocities in that sense. So it's very hard to say, you know, in that sense, but there is a lot of, we have few papers and publications where we are defining these effective apologies. So what are the specific elements? What words should be used? What emotional expressions should be used? How should you acknowledge and accept responsibility? Is that important element? And at what point of an apology should that come? You know, what specific reparations should be offered? So we have designed, so to speak, based on our researches, theoretically speaking, the most effective apology as such. But I cannot answer the question, you know, single-handedly or, you know, unilaterally, because it's a very complex and broad question.
Ok, hvala vam. Idemo dalje. Gospodin David Hudson je na redu da čujemo i stav Evropske komisije o tranzicionoj pravdi na Zapadnom Balkanu. Gospodin Hudson je viši stručnjak u Centru Evropske komisije za vladavinu prava, osnovna prava i demokratiju. On radi u Direktoratu za pridruživanje i govorit će nam o posebnom pristupu Evropske komisije prema tranzicionoj pravdi na Zapadnom Balkanu, koji je postao posebno konkretan 2018. godine, dakle ne tako davno. Gospodine Hudson, izvolite.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and it's very good to be here. I'm going to have to unplug that. I pause for a moment because, I mean, often as the European Commission, we're accused of being aliens who sort of land in and don't understand the context and the situation and make matters worse. And today, possibly for the first time, I very much feel like that alien beaming my messages into you from another planet, from planet Brussels. And it's actually quite reflective in some respects, because the presentation which I'm going to give is starkly different to everybody else's, because the way in which we as an organization, as an institution, deal with transitional justice is starkly different to the way in which you live transitional justice in your countries and the way in which you find mechanisms to make it work. And therefore, trying to fit in the mentality and the mindset that we have into the framework of today is something that has me in my own head as I speak, trying to rewrite my presentation. Luckily, or unluckily for you, much of what I have to say you have heard before, because we're a bureaucracy, we're slow moving, we're not terribly imaginative. Once we have a policy, that policy rolls on over a long period of time, perhaps with some minor evolutions, but rarely with revolution. We, in the Western Balkans, as the European Commission, have a policy which we like to think is less transitional justice, more transformative justice, in that we're not looking at the Western Balkans in traditional transitional justice terms, that we are looking at a much broader change in systemic change in terms of the functioning of the judiciary, the functioning of the public administration, the functioning of the police, prosecution, the functioning of society as a whole. And within that, we have often worked on the assumption that we need to look at specific elements of transitional justice, fight against impunity, to an extent, missing persons, landmines, but we've never treated transitional justice in the same way that, say, the United Nations does as a whole, or indeed even in the way in which the External Action Service does in terms of the transitional justice guidelines, because we, as part of the accession process, have a specific carve out from the way in which the European Union deals with transitional justice in the rest of the world, because we deal with it in this very specific context that we're working in. And that context has some advantages and some disadvantages. And the advantages are that where we have an incentive to move forward, we have greater leverage than we do anywhere else in the world. The disadvantage is that, well, it's twofold. Where we do not seem to have that leverage, that expectation of movement in the accession process, then you see that it falls by this process falls by the wayside. You also see that we focus more in some areas rather than others. We don't really have any experience or any particular view on commemoration, for example. We have member state experiences, but we have no acquis. We have nothing hard and concrete, legal, in terms of standards that we can bring in and say, you have to do this. The only way in which we bring these elements in is to an extent through the negative elements that you see in terms of interim benchmarks that we have with Serbia about recognition and about implementation and acceptance of ICTY verdicts. So it's not that we're speaking in terms of commemoration, it's that we're speaking in terms of what you cannot say rather than what you can say. And so therefore, our process, whilst perhaps reaching further in some areas, reaches not quite as far in others. As you said, in 2018, and we covered this actually at last year's conference in Zagreb, we had the launching of our Western Balkan strategy. We had a great deal of hope and expectation we would be able to make progress in a number of areas. And when you look at what we then called our flagship actions, when you look at what has also happened with the Sofia Summit Declaration, we have made some progress. Unfortunately, on RECOM, which was our #1 priority, we did not get the statute adopted. We've had to, and I think this is a lesson we learned in a number of areas. We hit a very major political obstruction. We've had to find another way around. You as an initiative, as a body, have had to find other ways around and other paths of moving forward with what you wish to achieve. We hope that we can come back to the statute when the political moment is there. But currently, we are working to support you, and further support hopefully will be coming as well to help you in the path that you're now taking. With the residual mechanism for the international criminal tribunals, we continue to support those financially and politically as well. And there we see that there are developments, not developments in The Hague, but developments within the region, where you see that the continued transfer of evidence, the continued transfer of files across from The Hague to the countries of the region is actually feeding in and is hopefully seeing that there will be local justice. We see this most recently in Montenegro. We've also seen it recently we see it a lot in Bosnia as well. But there is this flow coming out to ensure that justice can be done nationally. Maybe not at the pace that everyone would like to see, but the elements of it are there. We, in terms of missing persons, and there will be the session tomorrow, we have supported ICMP through a regional project. We have a regional project, the UK government has a regional project that run in parallel, because this was an area that pre-2018 we had been, let's be frank, very weak on. We had not done a lot on missing persons. We'd recognized the weakness and we've tried to move this forward. Looking forward on that, well, actually, let's come back to that, to the session tomorrow. We've also been doing some work, as we said we would, on landmines. We've decided that the regional approach is not the best one for landmines, but we've done a regional assessment of the situation where the needs are, and we will now be targeting, as we go into EPA 3, additional funds, well, specifically targeted funds through our national facilities into dealing with landmines where that's required. There's also been a push more broadly on culture and on youth. Obviously, we have RICO, but we also have actions such as Erasmus+, which we said at the time of the strategy, at the time of the Sofia Declaration, that we would look at these issues, youth exchanges, in order to build on developing some of the understanding that other speakers have mentioned, and which no doubt will be mentioned later on during the course of the day. Since then, there has been, our further work has been less directly focused on transitional justice reconciliation than it was in 2018. And this is slightly cyclical, and this is reflected not just in the work of the Commission, but when you look at something like the Berlin process, where we had a very strong reconciliation, transitional justice, good neighbourly relations element in the London summit, in Poznan as well, to a slightly lesser extent. We haven't seen the same thing this year. And equally on the side of the Commission, the focus has switched more towards the investment and economic plan to, in light of the COVID crisis, in strengthening regionally economic development, in promoting economic ties. Now, this does not mean that we've forgotten about the transitional justice elements, that we've forgotten about the fight against impunity. It means that they are not the headline messages that we are currently passing, but they are still there, and they are still current, and they still form part of the benchmarks and the negotiating standards required. Because let's not forget, some of these hard issues, and it tends to be the hard issues, the legal issues that we are best suited for dealing with, all feature under Chapter 23 of the accession negotiations. So these issues are still there, even if we're not pronouncing them day to day. Where we are looking still through the investment and economic plan, and this goes back to something I've often said in the past, which relates back to our fundamental mindset as an organization. As the European Commission, we are functionalists. We are built in the image of Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. That we believe that you promote cooperation and understanding by working together on issues of common interest, and that we have always had a very strong economic underpinning on that. When your entire organization is built on a coal and steel community, that tends to still be the model which underpins your thinking in a number of other areas. And so therefore, though there's no very direct link or immediate reference to transitional justice, to reconciliation, in terms of the investment and economic plan, it still underpins the thinking. It's about cooperating, it's about working together, it's about strengthening links and ties and understanding between countries. There is also, however, very explicitly still there, a very strong rule of law dimension. And for us, that's important because that's our way into this whole question of transitional justice. We do very much view it as a rule of law issue, because as the outsiders, what else can we do? It's very, we're not in a position to come in and say, this is how you should think or behave towards each other. That's something we could never successfully do or would never want to. So we do, as our basis, deal with this as a rule of law issue. And in terms of rule of law, we are still there and we are still present. In terms of the other dimensions, we do carry on seeking to assist in terms of, as I said, providing facilities for the youth within the region, looking at enhanced cultural cooperation, looking through our civil society facility at creating frameworks and structures which enable local organizations to do the things that you think are necessary to move this process forward. But that's not direct guidance on our part, that's creating the framework for you to be able to do what you want to do. I'm going to leave it there at this point. I know I've been quite short, but because a lot of what we do has already been done and said in the past couple of conferences, and also because I want to leave more time for the discussion and the questions, because this is where the more interesting elements maybe come out, and I don't want to prejudge that. I'd rather deal with that during this discussion and the question and answers. And it also means that the two following speakers can have whichever minute I haven't taken up to share between them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hudson. Actually, in my introduction, I made a mistake about the year. The key year was probably 2015, when the EU's policy framework on support to transitional justice was adopted, which clearly states that the EU considers transitional justice to be a priority for candidate countries and potential candidates. So I hope the EU has not given up on this very valuable document. And you've hinted actually why it is so valuable, not only for what we're here interested most about transitional justice, but also for the economy and development of business opportunities and whatever. And that's the underpinning rule of law issue. You know, if you have transfer of evidence to prosecutors and courts, they don't do anything with it, you know, and if you don't have regional agreements who allow for prosecution, then we cannot, after all these years, talk about solely transfer of data from international tribunal to local judiciaries as a positive step forward. So I think there is plenty to talk about during the discussion, and also I would encourage discussion among panelists, but we should, would you like to comment on what I said, or shall we move forward?
I very briefly to comment. Yes, no, I mean, the guidelines, the broader transitional guidelines, I make that reference, and I was part of the team that sort of worked on the drafting. There's a very specific, I think it literally is a box in the text, at least it was. And the idea there was to give a specific context, because when you look at transitional justice in a broad traditional sense, it is, I mean, as Professor Puhovski said, it's often about creating the situations for a truce. It's about stopping a conflict. It's about separating warring parties and trying to provide a minimum level for the future. Yeah, and that's not what we're doing in the Western Balkans. So we very much wanted in the transitional justice guidelines to reflect upon the fact that the process that we're engaged in is, or should be, genuinely transformative rather than transitional. And I understand, I was speaking to some academics I know who work on the region the other day, and even this whole idea of transition in the broad sense, in the political economic sense, is beginning to be contested, because it suggests that there's an end point as opposed to a constant evolution. And for us, the process that we're engaged in as part of the accession process is long-term evolutionary, and very much more than what was contained within the concept of transitional justice doesn't encompass what we ultimately want to do to a justice system. You know, and fight against impunity is part of a much broader systemic change within the justice system to ensure that, yes, the legislation is correct, that judges respect the rule of law, that processes work, that the system as a whole works and is respected, and delivers the results that the citizens and the victims expect. And so that was why within the 2015 strategy, we have this very specific reference and a very specific way of dealing with the accession process, which actually is derived from the human rights guidelines which precede the transitional justice guidelines, where exactly that same format is adopted. I mean, that's what I'd say about the strategy there, or about the 2015 guidelines. In terms of the rest, I mean, even if the focus, even if the headlines and the narrative is now on the investment and economic side, and I won't throw it up on the screen now, but I have the investment and economic plan in another tab. Even there is a long section on fundamentals, on democracy, on rule of law, on public administration. And even there, you know, where we're talking about the economy and so on, it is recognized fundamentally that if you do not have the rule of law, you do not have that basis, then you can't have economic development. You can't actually have anything. And so it is there, and it's not forgotten. The current messaging is a little different, but it's there, and it will continue to be there, and it will continue to be a part of this process from the beginning to the end. and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. Ok, nastavljamo dalje sa gospođom Vjollcom Krasniqi, profesorkom Filozofskog fakulteta Univerziteta u Prištini. Ona će nam reći nešto više o tome kako se razvijaju procesi tranzicione pravde na Kosovu. Hvala vam, Vjollca, što ste danas s nama. Izvolite.
Thank you, Tee. Good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to engage on this important panel. So I would like to start briefly just from the entry point of the concept of transitional justice, and also to advocate for the need for both retributive and restorative justice mechanisms, not only in Kosovo, but also wider in the region. Then in the second part of my presentation, I will focus on the narratives of war and justice and how they relate and their relationship to the transitional justice mechanisms. Thirdly, I will also focus briefly on the institutional reform as part of this, perhaps what David also presented on the idea that perhaps there is a need to go beyond or to stretch the concept of transitional justice and think more about transformative justice, where I think the institutional reform becomes one of the important aspects of it. And in the conclusion, I will also point out more a bit in greater detail about the need of the combination of the retributive and restorative mechanisms in dealing with the past and post-war justice. So let me begin by saying that to analyze the post-war transitional justice mechanisms and the evolution of present-day practices for dealing with the past, it is without doubt relevant, even today, after more than 2 decades of the 1998-1999 war ending in Kosovo. So the questions that I've been thinking about and trying to address in many different venues through academic research, but also in activism on dealing with the past, is to look at how has transitional justice shaped the transition from conflict to peace. How is the past portrayed? What is the potential of rule of law to respond to antagonistic narratives of the past? And of course, what are the representations of the past becoming more inclusive and less antagonistic? The practice of transitional justice has a constitutive effect on the building of the new democratic order and peace. As a strategy of dealing with the past, transitional justice is always contextual and embedded in social practices and imaginings for the future of the society. So we live in the present, we think about the past, regard the past, but also have an eye for the future. So how societies choose to deal with the past has consequences for conflict transformation in the present as well as in the future. So frames of dealing with the past and accountability mechanisms through transitional justice in post-Yugoslav states have been shaped by various discourses on peace building, institution building, reconciliation, and aspirations for European Union membership. These strategies have also incorporated diverse perspectives and actors from international but also local context. Transitional justice, as I would like to position also methodologically, is a prime vehicle for addressing harm caused in the past. It is a vehicle for addressing issues of war, guilt, and responsibility for war crimes through a process of retribution and restoration. Retributive justice, which seeks to punish perpetrators, mainly still continues to involve international war crimes tribunals. It reflects a top-down approach to tackling injustice in wars, while restorative justice focuses on healing wounds through venues such as truth and reconciliation commissions, memory projects, reparations, and people's tribunals. This is a more of a bottom-up approach involving a far greater number of people. And as two gender theorists have pointed out, they are Julie Mertes and Christine Chenkin. They argue that retributive tribunals offer a good starting point for dealing with the past, but they cannot serve the purpose of punishing the wrongdoers, delivering justice, and also helping societies that have undergone war to move forward in peacetime. Such societies must turn to other restorative justice mechanisms to achieve reconciliation, as well as justice for victims. So, but as it has been shown, for example, in the case of the French trials after the Second World War, the search for truth through trials is important for reconciliation. But the over-reliance on truth undermines the fact that rapprochement is not premised on truth, but on accepted myths. And I hear the key questions here also continues and it remains relevant is what are the truths that have been, what are the myths that have been held so strongly, or they continue to be accepted myths about what the past constitutes, what happened in the past. So meanings, definitions, and explanations of war tend to focus on the relational aspects of morality and justice, which are broad, definitely are broad and contested terms. Morality is a language of justification of war, which is used to sustain war. War, in return, seeks to sustain and legitimate the morality of war and the meanings of peace. So hence, the shifting boundaries of the discourses of war should be viewed also as sites of struggles over morality and sentiments. Looking at the Kosovo War, the framing of the Kosovo conflict is premised on the grand narrative of the collective struggle of the Kosovo Albanians against the oppression and violence of the Serbian state and the military machine of Slobodan Milosevic's regime. So the dominant discourse on the resistance of Kosovo Albanians in the 1990s capitalized both on the civil resistance under the leadership of Democratic League of Kosovo and its leader Ibrahim Rugova, and the Kosovo Liberation Army's armed resistance. However, this does not understate the fact that the national discourses among the Kosovo Albanians are not freed of tension and contested legacies, especially of their divisions over the wartime memory. The connecting thread, to be sure, is in this circuit is that of the struggle for liberation and independence. And the Kosovo Albanians mobilization was framed as a collective struggle for liberation, with the armed resistance placed within the paradigm of a just war. And we see that even today as the dominant narrative. So the language used to discuss the Kosovo conflict is loaded with, of course, moral meanings, and situating the war narrative and the KLA's conducting war within the doctrine of the just war. This discourse is a strategy of defense in moral terms. So the dominant frames are that of the just war, heroism, and victimhood. The just war discourse in Kosovo is strongly influenced by notions of freedom and self-determination, liberation, heroism, virtuous manhood, sacrifice, and victimhood. It is characterized by splits between aggression and defense of the home front, defense of the home front, between victims and perpetrators, and between combatants and civilians. And in this ontology of conflict, any possibility of violent acts against the other has been rendered impossible. Thus, the frames of war are representations constructed through a dynamic interplay between politics, experience, and story or storytelling. Indeed, the just war discourse, by placing emphasis on the notions of a liberation war, heroism, sacrifice, and victimhood, has been the dominant conception of the framing. And this process has involved the use of selective language and symbols to construct a coherent narrative based on the concept of a morally just cause, acceptable conducting war, and the moral reification of sacrifice and collective victimhood. So I think to make this shift from the narratives and the morality of war into institutional reform, that looks at the war crimes and also the experiences in the war, I think Kosovo provides a shining example of how international criminal tribunals can trigger domestic legal and institutional reform. I think this examples is very much present also for Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. And because also what becomes in the nationally within the institutional court, institutional justice system is also somehow a translation of the international systems into domestic ones in the frame of the institutional reform. So in Kosovo, transitional justice institutions have pluralized, and legal change has been frequent. And as a result of that, Kosovo hosts a whole number of new institutions, from specialized courts and prosecutors who are empowered to investigate, prosecute, and judge perpetrators of human rights abuses and war crimes, to a hybrid court that deals with very specific crimes. And this is the creation of the Special Criminal Tribunal, even though this project or this part of was not an easy task for the Kosovo political elite, and especially for the political parties close to former Kosovo Liberation Army structures, such as the Democratic Party of Kosovo. So yet the Democratic Party, which together with it at that time when the Specialist Chambers law was adopted, with its government coalition partner, the Democratic League of Kosovo, that had the majority of seats in the Kosovo parliament, endorsed the proposal and legislation for the court. And two other political parties related with former Kosovo Liberation Army, that's the Alliance for Future of Kosovo and NISMA for Initiative for Kosovo, NISMA, along with Vendosia, strongly opposed it on grounds that it's the crimes of the state of Serbia that should be put on trial, because Serbia was a perpetrator and Kosovo was a victim. So again, here this interplay between victimhood and perpetrators. So the Special Criminal Tribunal has been represented and continues even today as to be perceived as an intrusion by the international community in Kosovo and an unjust imposition. And according to this script, if the tribunal is an intrusion by the international community and an unjust imposition, and this script leaves no place for any blameworthiness. And moreover, the Special Criminal Tribunal is placed in the symbolic economy of Kosovo's friendship with and/or accountability to the international community. For example, mimicking a Western type of discourse on public accountability, then Prime Minister of Kosovo and later on President of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, stated the following. This is the beginning of the quote. Kosovo institutions are facing an imposition from the international community, fully immoral and unjust. Our consciousness would remain stained in case we do not provide an adequate response to the request of the EU and the USA for the creation of the Special Criminal Tribunal to address allegations made in the Dick Martis report approved by the Council of Europe in 2010, end of quote. I think here two important aspects, which are parts of broader national narratives that flow through this quote. First is that the criminal justice appeals to moral and political legitimacy. Thus, it signifies a displacement of the responsibility for the creation of the Special Criminal Tribunal from the Kosovo polity towards the international community. And the second aspect relates to the political importance for the Kosovo government, and especially the leaders that are close to the former Kosovo Liberation Army, that it was not them nor the government that initiated or sanctioned such a project. So it's part of the way of how transitional justice the project was implemented in Kosovo, but at the same time is projected as this is not what Kosovo decided to do. nonetheless, it agreed to do it. So in other words, the Special Criminal Tribunal is perceived to be an externally driven institution, with the Kosovo political elite having no authorship in its making. Symbolically, the Special Criminal Tribunal occupies a space between the ideologies of the just war and innocence and the friendship partnership between Kosovo's and international community, notably the United States and the European Union. And here, the questions of accountability and responsibility have been so thoroughly politicized that the question of justice has become a secondary concern. So judicial reform has assumed an important role in the Kosovo government agenda. War crimes trials as instruments of pursuing justice are shaped by dominant war narratives and also how justice is implemented. They are contested and disputed because they include notions of national identity, sentiments, and belonging.
Professor Krasniqi, could I ask you, because we're running late a bit,
sure.
Could I ask you just to wrap up and give us a reflection?
Yes. So I will
regarding the response of civil society of Kosovo to the latest indictment against its president. I think that would be interesting for everybody here. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to conclude that trials, as Marcos Yell has argued often, are a focal point for the collective memory of the whole nations, and that they may offer a moment of truth, a process whereby long-held assumptions, beliefs, and commitments in the lives of individuals and collectives are assessed, but they are not sufficient. So there is a need of retributive and restorative justice to enable societies to come to terms with the past and achieve closure, because that's a necessary component for moving forward. So the limitations of the courts are important and retribution, but the focus should be also on the restorative measures and to enable societies to understand, to come to terms with the past and move forward for the future. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to comment on the response of the civil society to the recent indictments, Kosovo, or is that?
I can do that later on, if that's okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Dobro, idemo dalje i Slađana je bila vrlo strpljiva sve ovo vreme. Slađana je postdoktorantkinja u Centru za studije mira Norveškog univerziteta u Tromsu. Ona će nam sada govoriti o njenom pogledu na koncept transformativne pravde o kome je govorio i David. Slađana, ja predlažem da možda za naše slušaoce i gledaoce koji nisu najsigurniji u čemu je razlika koju je gospodin Hudson potencirao između tranzicione pravde i transformativne pravde, da to možda ukratko pojasnite i da nam onda kažete da li mislite da je taj koncept te transformativne pravde kojim se i vi bavite rešenje za nas na ovim prostorima koji se nalazimo u svevrsnim krizama tranzicione pravde. Hvala vam. Izvolite.
I'll speak in English after all. Good morning. Yes, well, I would be glad to talk more about transformative justice and how it relates or how it overlaps with transitional justice with what kind of effects. But when it comes to transformative justice in a way that Mr. David Hudson talked about it, I would like also to hear more about that, how the EU actually understands transformative justice. And what is it that the EU, through its approach to transitional justice in the Western Balkans, aims to transform? I am happy to hear that the EU and the European Commission are thinking about transitional justice and dealing with the past through the prism of transformation. But I'm also, how shall I put it? I'm trying to be cautious and careful about getting excited about it, because we cannot, there are limits to how much we can talk about transformation through transitional justice, as long as we don't talk about foundational limitation of transitional justice and the wider project of liberal or neoliberal peace building. because that is something that we do not mention very often when we talk about the crises of transitional justice, because we don't talk about crisis in singular. We talk about crises in plural, or a state of a permanent crisis. And that is not only in our region, but it is also that is a state, or like a happening with a norm as such on a global level and on a conceptual level. Because transitional justice as a virtue field has this, how shall I put it, tendency to overpromises and underdelivers. Because the values and the goods that transitional justice is aiming to deliver, peace, justice, truth, reconciliation, those are universal values, and you know, something that everyone strives towards. But they do define in different contexts. They are defined differently. They're filled out with different components. And transitional justice, with its framework, and also like with its, how should I put it, with its origin within the human rights framework and liberal democracy and liberal peace, and focus mostly on the criminal and legal forms of fighting for justice, limits the space for definition of the peace, of truth, of justice, of reconciliation. So it becomes, to a certain extent, a bit formal, because that is the limitation. So all the limitations, and I don't think we have enough time here to go into it, but all the limitations of the human rights framework which focuses on or gives primacy to political and civil rights, and forgets or puts in a second on the second seat, on the co-driver's seat, socioeconomic justice. They also affect how the way transitional justice talks about the violations and the conceptions of justice. So when we talk about the crisis, we actually talk about a crisis that is happening on 4 levels, or in 4 dimensions in our region. The most often talked level is the level of nation states and political elites who are reluctant to be genuine about facing the past and genuinely supporting transitional justice, and using this virulent nationalistic rhetoric, denying genocides, denying crimes, and also weaknesses of institutions, weaknesses of the rule of law, corruption, party patronage, or kleptocratic regimes, and all that, and how all that influences regional cooperation or the lack thereof. So basically, all these aspects, when we talk about the crises on the national levels, are a result of inefficiency of the international interventions when it comes to liberal peace building in the Balkans. And because transitional justice does not happen in a vacuum, it happens in the wider context. So all the other reforms, failings on all the other aspects of the reforms, influences how transitional justice is implemented. The second level of the crisis is when we talk about whether the EU is putting enough pressure on the national elites to actually continue dealing with the past. But the EU's approach towards transitional justice is also very much limited with its approach to liberal peace building, which is very much within the framework of liberal peace, again, focusing on building of state building, institution building, and civil and political rights. So I would really like to hear a bit more from Mr. David Hudson, how the European Commission understands transformative justice. What is it that the European Commission aims to transform, and in which way, with what kind of mechanisms? Because I'm a bit skeptical about talking about transformation through the rule of law, the way it is, at least in the way it has been applied so far. So yes, and the third level of the crisis is that's something that I already mentioned, and that's the crisis of the norm as such, or the limitations of transitional justice, mainstream transitional justice, and its mechanisms to deliver everything that they have promised. And the most important, I think, level in which crisis is manifesting itself is at the level of the victim survivors and their families. And I think that is something that we haven't mentioned so far, and that is the most important crisis, because the victims association and their families have been the most eager supporters and have invested the most emotional labor in the whole enterprise of transitional justice in the Western Balkans. And the fact that they are exhausted, that they are disappointed, disillusioned, is the most serious concern for transitional justice in the Western Balkans. And that is something that, if we are talking about future of transitional justice, or future, I would rather say future of dealing with the past, because I think we need to think about dealing with the past wider and look for other policy and discursive entrance into that topic, into that problematic outside of transitional justice as well, to try to branch out. And that is the whole point of transformative justice, because the theoretical demands for transformative justice actually do say that, okay, transformative justice addresses those violations that transitional justice fails to address, mostly socioeconomic justice and structural violence. That also Professor Žarka Puhovski, I was very happy to hear that when he started his talk by saying that there is this long duration and continuity of injustices, and transitional justice as a mainstream field cannot address that. It fails to address it. It just doesn't have the tools, doesn't even see socioeconomic and structural violence. It cannot address it with its mechanisms. And I digress now, but the point is, transformative justice is mostly focusing on socioeconomic injustices, at least in theory, and also aims at using different shifts, locus, shifts power, and shifts priorities from transformative justice. So instead of just focusing on institutions building and political and civil rights, when we talk about transformation, we talk about addressing socioeconomic injustices, structural violences, paying more attention to reparations, but not only reparations. Because when we talk about transitional justice, we mostly focus on bodily harms and on physical violence, but we don't talk about the economic destruction and all the economic grievances that people actually went through. Because from the perspective of those who have had direct experiences of violence, those violations are not separated. All those violations are experienced simultaneously, and many of those injustices are actually, there's a continuity between the injustices during the 90s and the injustices that people are feeling right now or experiencing right now. And some of those injustices are also perpetrated through the mechanisms of transitional justice, because whether by providing a hierarchies of violations or injustices or hierarchies of the victimhood, or through neglect, through neglect and omissions to address certain issues. So to wrap this up, I would say that if we are to talk about the future of transitional justice, we need to start from the victim's needs. Where do they actually put the priority? And then think about how to address those needs, because I think that is something that is a pressing thing right now, because we are talking about 25 years of transitional justice that has been very slow, very painful, and I would like to be wrong when I say this, that I'm wrong when I say this, but I don't see the reason to expect that from now on the things will go faster or in a kind of be more efficient or effective. So I think that focusing on the victim's needs, focusing on reparations, focusing on finding missing persons, but also looking outside of the mainstream tool of transitional justice, trying to find different policy entry points, linking, for example, the problem of wartime rapes and children born out of rape with the present day problem of femicide, gender-based violence, family violence, and then linking transitional justice with WPS agenda, women, peace and security, and trying to actually find some other ways, trying to build, when it comes to grassroots and civil society organization, trying to build wider coalitions based on solidarity, and maybe pushing in that way to address some of the problems of the violences from the 90s. Thank you.
Hvala mnogo, Slađana, pogotovo na ovom povratku fokusa na žrtve. Žarko, vi ste hteli da se uključite, da nešto komentarišete. Izvolite.
Very short comment. Ms. Lazić has said about wider coalitions means something that has also to do with the 25 years passing by. Namely, we have to decide to part quite soon, to part from the victims and their families. Justice is not about victims. Justice is about society as a whole. Victims are never satisfied with justice. They always want more. So it's not, or they would like to all the perpetrators to be killed sometimes. So that's not something that has to be the basis for the position. They are, of course, the first to be taken into account because they are the victims, the family of the victims, and so on. But in the long run, it's about society as a whole, to reconstruct or transform the society in a way that this would not be possible in the next future. Things to deal with the gender justice or social justice or regional justice that are practically have not been discussed. For instance, you can't say in many respects that during the war, women were by far not the first victims. Men were. After the war, women are victims in the first place. And these are things that has to be discussed to take all the concrete elements into account if we want really to take, again, I'm emphasizing this, society as a whole into account. And I think that's what we have to do for the next future, because we are all going to be out of the game in the next future, some of us sooner, some of you later, but then the question of justice is still going to be there, even with the people who do not remember anymore. Final sentence, World War II is still the issue of justice in the area. And practically no one lives who was active in these periods of time. Yet it is something that deals with 41 to 91, 91 to 2020 or 21 and so on. So it's still some kind of corporation of injustice from former periods.
Thank you. Yes, and it lives as remains as a family heritage. So it is something to take into account, definitely in all of our state. I would like to move on in the following manner. I would like Mr. Hudson to ask you to comment on what Slađana and in particular has asked you to comment and define transformative justice that the EU perceives now as a priority rather than transitional concept as such. I wasn't really certain about it, but if you could just make it more understandable for us. And then, if you could bear with me, I know it has been a long time today on the panel, and then I would like you to first comment, to make a short final comment on what would you suggest the civil society in our region should change in its approach, or how has your perception been on our efforts, and would you have an advice for us? And then I would like everyone else to very briefly have express a comment for the EU, if you consider EU should change their approach in any way, and to give an advice to the civil society. And then we will open for everyone in our audience who I don't see him, but hope they're with us. Okay, Mr. Hudson, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, the difference between transformative justice and transitional justice and the EU concept. Confession to make. The word transformative justice does not appear in any EU document. I made the fatal mistake of trying to be more interesting than just being a boring civil servant and try and come up with some simple label for what we're doing. You're right, it's not terribly well defined because we haven't defined it. And it was an attempt on my part to render slightly simpler this understanding of what we're doing in the broad context of EU accession. Because anything that we do on transitional justice, and it's not transitional justice in the traditional sense, and it doesn't have exactly that scope, and it doesn't have that focus or exactly those mechanisms, which is why I'm always very reluctant to use the term. I actually use it relatively little in our documents on enlargement. But it was to try and get a grasp of those elements that Slađana said, which are much, much broader. And listen, the easiest way for me to do this is to read a very short quote from our Western Balkan strategy, which is very broad, but which sort of encompasses the overall idea which then all of our instruments are subordinate to. So the quote is as follows, and is at the bottom of page 3, and it runs: everyday life in the Western Balkans should progressively become closer to life within the European Union. Ultimately, citizens yearn to live in countries that are prosperous and equal, where the rule of law is strong and corruption is rooted out. And then there's a bit more to it afterwards about processes and so on. But ultimately, in very simplistic terms, because we're engaged in a process of accession, we're in a process of bringing this region into the European Union, we want this region to be as the European Union is, for citizens in the region to be as citizens of the European Union, to have the same sense of what their life is, to have the same belief in the rule of law, and in fairness and equality, and in those values which we hold dear. And therefore, in that context, this idea of transformative justice, which came about in a conversation I was having with a colleague of mine who was working on Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time, and we were discussing the transitional justice strategy there. And it was, well, we go beyond that. You know, what we're doing in the field of legacy of the past, if you like, which is the term I use more often, is a subpart of this much broader effort in terms of justice as a whole. You know, legal in a legal sense, in a broader sense as well. If you're engaged in societal change, if you're engaged in economic change, then that does incorporate a number of these areas that Slađana said. If you're looking at issues of equality, we will ultimately get there. It's not top of the agenda at the moment because violence is more pressing. But you know, when you look at gender-based violence, that's an issue we need to deal with now. When you start looking at pay gaps and so on, that's an issue that we will have to address. But further down the line, you need to get these things prioritized. So this concept of transitional justice, in the sense in which I had it in my non-academic, slightly fuzzy, not terribly well-defined way, is as a part of that process, is as a part of this broader transition, which is this path that you are engaged in, because politically that is what you have said you want to do, and we are supporting you along. Now, whether that support's effective or not, question and answer time. We'll come back to that later. In terms of what I see you doing and what you should do or not do, I'm the alien. I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is the one thing I have learned is, and Professor Puhovski is the primest example here, probably, and Natasha as well, you never give up. And that's always, whenever I speak to people from non-governmental organizations who are discussing either our lack of support or the difficulties they have with the government, never, ever, ever give up. Because that's what those who oppose you want. And you can't give them that. You have to find ways of doing things. If plan A doesn't work, you have to go to plan B. You have to go to plan C and get us to help you support that way, or whatever it is, or whoever it is. But you cannot ever stop. And that is the only, again, easy as an outsider, but that's the only advice, that's the only valuable advice that there is. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I'll stop there.
Tee, may I answer your question earlier about the reaction of the civil society groups, and also where do we see civil society today in relation to transitional justice? First, I think that's the prime example of how different narratives and ideologies become so solidified within the society that leave no space for plural regimes of truths to be open in the public space. So that's an example of it. That the dominant narrative becomes so entrenched that they stifle any critical thinking and also diverse opinions and strategies on how to deal with the past. So I believe here the role of the civil society is crucial to nurture the public space where different diverse experiences, diverse memories, and also stories are being presented in the public space. And for that, the civil society has really an enormous potential to expand and to nurture this public space and the culture of dialogue about different experiences. Something that we have witnessed, at least in the Kosovo context, is this reliance on the these dominant narratives, or the dominance of the narratives, and also the shrinking space for representation of individual stories. So the individuals become part of the group. So when we talk about justice and transitional justice, we think about group categories, and here nation and national identity and national belonging becomes the strongest one. So in this, I think the civil society's potential to bring to nurture the public space and to bring individual stories and experiences of ordinary people, not the narratives that have been established or solidified through political entrepreneurships and political ideologies that define belonging and identity in terms of very exclusionary nationalist ideologies. So I think second would be also on archiving stories, something like Humanitarian Law Center has done for so many years, on collecting victims' experiences and stories about the harm done in war. And also, I think another dimension here is very important, as Slađana earlier mentioned, is to bring gender also in the way on how we look at the processes of dealing with the past and transitional justice, because violence pre-conflict, during conflict, and after the conflict, gender violence remains constant. Just it shifts from different forms of violence. And also to perhaps one of the role of the civil society, as I see, is to make visible the structural inequalities that affect the societies and groups in different way. And gender, I think, here and ethnicity, having this lens of intersectionality into the analysis of justice, I think, is very important for the civil society when dealing with the wrongs conducted in the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krasniqi. Sabina, please, would you like to go on?
Yes, I'm just thinking how to most efficiently use the time and what to focus on, because I'm also just inspired by Vjollca's comment on creating, and the importance of creating different or introducing different stories, and through introducing of different stories, introducing different perspectives, and hence building different narratives. And this is maybe something that I would just like to do a comment on, because it can offer a potential way out of the crisis that we are facing at many levels, obviously. And this is just something that I would just like to introduce as a point of reflection more than anything with time. And it is about introduction of, when we speak of the past, we often think, not often, we almost exclusively think and conceive of the past through the lens of immorality and through the lens of human rights violations. But there is another side to the past and to the conflict that has also occurred, but it's not often mentioned and unpacked, and that is the side of morality and humanity, and of hundreds and thousands of ordinary people sacrificing their lives and losing their lives often as a consequence to do the right thing. And the wrong thing has been the norm. And I think the introduction of stories of such that we in our work call moral exemplar stories could be a way out of expanding and changing these narratives, particularly the narratives of who the other is. Because very often the other or the enemy, whoever that is perceived through a prism of homogeneous, evil, bad entity in that sense. And I think there is a way out of deconstructing and unpeeling or expanding this perception and understanding of who the other is, because it is a way of facilitating the other mechanisms of reconciliation. It is a way to facilitating the efficiency of dialogue, the efficiency of contact, and everything, and all these activities that happen more at maybe community or the bottom level, but there is a way out of this. So I just wanted to introduce this as a thought of how to move forward. Because what worries me is if we continue the path that we have been on for 25 years, and David mentioned this, keep going, don't give up. Well, not just victim group associations, but community members, citizens are, when you measure, they are giving up the hope. They're giving up the hope that societal transformation is possible. So we cannot continue with this path or on this path. There has to be a change, because systematic and sustainable transformations will not be able to take place without community participation, without communities' motivation to participate in any process or in any mechanism that we introduce, from whatever angle and whatever source we introduce that to. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, that not all that we need to change strategies. And I just wanted to give my 2 cents, so to speak, that there is a way of how to do this and go about this by transforming narratives about others through introduction of more moral stories that have occurred rather than immoral aspects of it as well.
Thank you, Sabina, very much. Okay, so we have literally 15 more minutes by the end. I promise that we will end earlier, but we have not included the audience, and I ask you kindly to bear for another 15 minutes so we can open the floor for questions from the audience. The audience, do you hear us? We haven't heard from you, or we don't see you. Would anyone like to pose a question? And if so, please press request to enter the panel. Mm-hmm. Here we have someone. Okay. We have 2 requests, and I will leave so they can join. I think this is the thing to do. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the amazing papers. That was really very interesting, high quality, and very informative. I just have one question to Žarko. You said, let's leave the victims behind. Very interesting, provocative point. But my question is, how can you separate the victims from society as a whole, as you suggest, as they are part of society and they might be very active in propagating and their story and feed into these master narratives, these what Vjollca called solidifying narratives that are so powerful and difficult to deal with. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Answer? Well, of course, we all are parts of society. The point is, we all are subjective as persons, individuals, groups, and so on. The question is, how far can we reach something that would be considered as a level of objectivity? Being a victim, I cannot be objective. I'm on one side, I might be right, and probably am right, but I'm a victim not because I was right. I'm a victim because I was weak. The moment we accept being weak as a special quality, is important in terms of post-war morality in which violence or being strong is not a special quality. That's something that we, quote unquote, need from the victims. But then they are in a position to say, we are rightfully not satisfied with this or with that. Objectively, they might be wrong. And that's the question we have to discuss. We were not ready to discuss it for years because it was an emotional question. And it was also part of the general atmosphere. Victims were understood in all these post-Yugoslav countries as the pioneers of the new society. And then people would be using this for other aspects of nationalistic ideologization. I see Natasha here, she can tell you what was the problem in trying to organize coordination, especially cooperation among the different groups of victims. Because they had problems in accepting they are both victims, although we are victims of your side and you are victims of our side. And that's something that people emotionally cannot accept so easily. People who were not involved are possibly in a position to object, but that's something that we are going to need in the future. That was my point.
Okay, thank you, Žarko. Natasha, izvoli.
Ako sam ja dobila reč, htjela bih da kažem da mi se jako dopalo, nekoliko panelista je pomenulo da ne treba odustati. Čini mi se da je to sada neki važan pristup u kontekstu zbilja krize i tranzicione pravde i krize od strategije, kako od strane međunarodne zajednice, tako kriza strategije na regionalnom nivou. Mi nemamo više tu političku volju bavljenja prošlošću, iskazivanja političke odlučnosti da izgradnja demokratske budućnosti zavisi od toga koliko se na političkom nivou bavimo odgovornošću. Tako da mislim da i na civilno društvo se odnosi ova vrlo važna poruka koju smo mi u koaliciji za Rekom jako dobro zapravo razumeli i odlučili da nećemo odustati, nastavljamo dalje i da je to taj jedino mogući pristup u situaciji kada nema političke volje. Htjela sam da pitam Sabinu u vezi sa nekim novim momentima u našem, da kažem, regionalnom okruženju u vezi sa izvinjenjima. Imali smo jako puno izvinjenja od strane političara, ali nema ni jednog izvinjenja koje je zapamćeno, prihvaćeno i na koje se u regiji pozivamo. Ja mislim da je bilo važno i kada su Ivo Josipović i Boris Tadić u jednom trenutku otišli u Vukovar i pored toga što su žrtve okrenule leđa. Čak mi se čini da je i to bilo važno, to okretanje leđa. Ali događa se sada da čak ima i civilno društvo određena, da kažem, pomeranja i odustajanje od nekih vrednosti za koje smo se zalagali 15-20 godina, to je javno izvinjenje, preuzimanje političke odgovornosti. U Beogradu se dogodilo da je na zatvorenom sastanku na kome su učestvovale određene nevladine organizacije, bio je prisutan, učestvovao i predsjednik Srbije i onda je nekim učesnicima došla ideja da pozovu predsjednika na minut ćutanja, odavanje pošte svim žrtvama. On je ustao, učestvovao u tome, da bi naknadno kasnije, kada je ta vest sa zatvorenog sastanka ušla u medije, u javnost, rekao da je on pristojan čovek, da će uvek ustati, odati poštu kad god ga neko pozove, kada je u pitanju odavanje pošte mrtvima. Znači, pozvan je kao predsjednik, a on je odgovorio da je on pristojan čovjek. On nije rekao, ja sam kao predsjednik smatrao da je to moja obaveza. Naravno, ja lično sam to vidjela i kao veliku grešku civilnog društva, ali bih voljela da čujem Sabinu, kako zapravo da nastavimo sa insistiranjem, sa tim zahtevom da postoji javno izvinjenje, kada nema političke volje za suočavanje sa prošlošću.
Again, a challenging question in itself, because we are at different levels, not just when we speak of where the political elite is, where the community and civil society is, but we are different levels of where we are heading and where we wish to go. So we are actually on different motivation paths, when we think about not just the past, but when we think about the future. So it's a very challenging question in itself, given the context and the time where we are and the process where we are, or to which we have arrived to when we speak about transitional justice, and more specifically, reconciliation. But to go back to the apology or what constitutes an effective apology, and what you just shared with us is exactly in line with what research, not just in former Yugoslavia, but research all over the world in different post-conflict contexts has been finding, is that these the simple words or simple gestures of apologies are not enough, are simply not enough to push the process forward, unless they contain an explicit verbal acceptance of moral responsibility for the past, particularly for the consequences and meanings and implications of human rights violations, and reparation programs and reparation offers. I think this is I'm speaking on behalf of what research has found, not on behalf of what I believe might be most effective. I'm speaking on the basis of evidence or empirical evidence, where the evidence is demonstrating constitutes an effective apology. And one more aspect I would like to accentuate, and this is not our work, this is work done by other researchers, is showing that spontaneous acts of apologies, rather than predetermined or consciously pre-designed and pre-planned offers of apologies, can be more effective as well, where one or political leaders spontaneously decides to offer, say something, or do something because the communities and the victim descendants and victim group members think of it as a more genuine expression and more genuine apology in comparison to those that have been preconceived and pre-planned as a political act and more as a political response to washing off, that's how they see it, washing off the dirt through simple words and verbal acts. So this is again, I just want to be careful here I don't want everybody who's watching us today to conclude that the apologies are not important. And the apologies do not matter. They are important, and they do indeed matter. But this is only the beginning of the story. And it is very important if we begin and open this path to continue the path, because if we just stop there, then things can deteriorate and things can actually be more detrimental for intergroup trust and intergroup reparations and reconciliations, more so than haven't they been given in the first place. So this is just an important note. Yeah, that would be it for me for now.
Hvala. Ajmo onda redom Besnik i Denisa. Izvolite.
Amen dëgjoni? Unë jam Besnik Beçaj, edhe dëgjoj, faleminderit shumë se këtë debat tillë. Falim pak a shumë për çdo gjë që përfshin drejtsinë tranzicionale, për ballafaqimimin me të kaluarën, por drejtësia tranzicionale, siç e dim, nuk është çdo gjë vetëm me të kaluarën. Edhe çka deshta me pyet të zotrin profesorin Žarko në këtë rast, është që a mendon që shtetet e Ballkanit ka ardhur koha që më koncentru pak më tepër në krijimin e narracioneve të përbashkëta për çështjet e të kaluarës. Jemi një gjenerat të re të cilët jemi ka mësojmë, ka lexojmë, ka studiojmë në narracione ndryshme për çështje të njëjta. Edhe përderisa shumë nga ne që jemi në moshë e dim pak a shumë që çka ka ndodhur në të vërtetë. Amo që nga 2 vite kemi gjeneratën e cila ka lind në tërësi pas luftës edhe nuk janë prekur nga lufta. A mendoni që në këtë formë edhe në këtë aspekt na ka krijuar gjenerata të reja me narracione të vjetra që janë bazuar në gjuhën e urrejtjes mes vetë dhe ndër fqinjore. A mendoni që duhet me fillu si shoqëri e Ballkanit Perëndimor me fillu një bashkëpunim me kriju narracione të përbashkëta për ngjarjet të cilat kanë ndodhur në të kaluarën. Faleminderit.
Žarko, samo pritisnite unmute.
Okay. Well, it would be nice, but it's in reality something that's not possible. What can be done is something that German and French historians and politicians have been doing since late 50s. You have a textbook in school. On the left side, you have French version. On the right side, you have German version. As a pupil or student, you have to know both sides, and it's up to you which are you going to accept. And that would be something that for us would be almost a revolution, although Mr. Hudson said they are not ready to accept revolutions, neither we are, because we have had some experience with that. However, I think it's very important to show both sides and to open the possibility for the people to accept what's going on. And another sentence, the history in the schools is really not so important as people believe, because if that would have been the case, Yugoslavia would still be a strong country existing in the Balkans. But in the 80s, people decided in conflict between the lies they would be hearing in the school and the lies in the family to accept the family lies rather than the school lies. And that was one of the reasons for the end of Yugoslavia. So you cannot change things by history in schools, but it is the first step. And I think that would be a first half step, at least to open both sides as a material that everyone in the school has to accept in terms of knowing, not accepting in terms of value judgment.
Denisa? Hvala, Žarko. Denisa?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for a fantastic panel. You addressed so many interesting issues from different perspectives, but I would like to address ask a question about the civil society. Address this question to practitioners, but I think also it's more interesting from a theoretical perspective. When we think about the role of civil society in transitional justice, we normally fall into, if you like, a sort of a classic sort of a pattern to look at nationalist elites and liberal progressive society that is trying to make a difference, put forth sort of this, if you like, the victims' rights, etc., democratize the discourse. But I think we have an issue in the Balkans, and not just in the Balkans, that this model of liberal civil society, illiberal state is just is not valid, in the sense that the space for the work of the liberal civil society is restricted by what we also call uncivil civil society, if you see what I mean, illiberal civil society groups, right? That they have all the trappings of the non-state sphere. They organize in a similar way, most recently also virtually in social media, etc. So if you look at, if you encourage liberal civil society to continue and to persevere, I think this needs to come with the recognition that their political space is not just restricted by illiberal nationalist elites, but also by the pressure, sort of horizontal pressure from illiberal civil society. So how do you then continue, and how maybe from the EU's perspective, given such a sort of the stress that you have on your kind of sort of the lines that kind of support civil society assistance and all that, how do you go about this? How do you encourage liberal civil society, and how do you take into account this kind of complex reality?
Hvala, Denisa. To je pitanje bilo za Davida Hudsona ili za sve paneliste?
Yes, well, obviously it has a practical implication from the EU, but I would also like to hear possibly from other panelists. I mean, I think it's a very important theoretical question as well, maybe Professor Puhovski, or, I mean, yeah, Vjollca also from the perspective sort of can answer, yeah.
If you'd like me to start, it's, you know, to use a cliche, it's difficult. On our side, we have seen a sort of evolution over the last, well, actually it's not an absolute recent phenomenon. You know, there has always been a sense of looking at what is civil society and looking at what is legitimately civil society and what isn't. But I think Denise's question goes beyond that, because in the past we have seen simply governments attempting to manipulate civil society for their own purposes. You know, and often has been the case where you've had discussions with government officials and they've gone, well, you want a civil society organization to look at this or provide a different view or so on and so forth. We'll go and make one for you. That's been a long-standing sort of response over the last 20 years that I've been working in the region. I think Denise's question, though, is not that. It's something different, that we have a civil society that does not necessarily share the values that, looking at the screen in front of me, we share, for want of a better way of saying it. And how do you deal with those types of organization? And for us, as the outsider in this, we need to be exceedingly careful, because in the same way as we broadly speak to all duly elected parliamentary political parties, not all, but usually, if we have to be very careful about which bits of civil society we decide we are not going to speak to, because that, to an extent, is playing God, playing political God, denigrating people's possibly legitimate views, and that we, therefore, the way in which we do this is, and I don't work directly on civil society, is we have various sort of filters that we look at in terms of values and so on. And, you know, as long as an organization is not overly breaching the various rules that we have, and I'm being very generic on this because I can't give you the exact specifics because it's not my area. But if you're promoting hate crime, obviously we're not going to fund you and we won't have a dialogue with you. If you hold views that aren't part of the liberal mainstream, but which don't promote, don't breach the guidance which we have, then we may well still have discussions with you, and we may talk with you, and we will then need to see if you make project proposals to us where we go. But there is a dividing line. It's just that I personally can't give you exactly where that line is, but there is one. And in broad terms, you can sort of understand and see the difference. But at the margins, it does become complicated. You know, how do you deal with, you know, civil society organizations that have a nationalist agenda? You know, and it's the question then becomes one of degree. How far does that agenda go? And it becomes one of judgment. You know, are these views which are being expounded against our values? To what extent are the values being expanded against the law? And it becomes difficult at the margins. We are attentive to it, though, and I will try and get out from my colleagues something better than this so that we can pass it on to you after the conference, and you can see better what our guidelines are. I'll speak to my colleagues who deal with the civil society facility. But sorry not to be more conclusive than that today for you. My answer is as empty as my bookshelf, I notice, unlike everybody else's. I'm moving at the moment. That's my defense.
Thank you, David. Would anyone like to comment on what Denise has said? Žarko, please go ahead.
Try to be as short as possible. It has started more or less as leftist, activist, organized liberal civil society, more or less. And then the right-wing political agenda took the toy from the leftists, basically. AfD in Germany, different groups in the United States, especially in Scandinavia, which no one expected for 15 years ago. And it had consequences, first of all, for the changing of the position in the mainstream public opinion. A simple example, there was yesterday a women handball match between Denmark and Croatia. Denmark has lost, and the reactions in Denmark were more primitive than usual in Croatia and Serbia, which 15 years ago would not have been possible. 5 major media in Denmark used the form Balkanic conspiracy because there were referees from Montenegro and Croatia won against Denmark. That would have not been possible 15 years ago. So it's not a post-Yugoslav problem, it's a general global problem. And there is one criteria only, and that's the generalization. Can you, in your program, accept the generalization? For instance, we have a lot of so-called NGOs from the right wing, especially from the Catholic Church organized groups, arguing for the life as the primary goal, as the primary value, sanctity of life, and so on and so on. And then you come and ask them, okay, if the life is first, then Croatia is second. Which means in Vukovar, you have been able to give Vukovar to the Serbs, Croatia for lives, not lives for Croatia. And they cannot follow it. Because they want to be not only human rights of unborn children, as they would say, but they want to be access for the human rights of the unborn Croatian children. And then they are in a problem. This is not going to stop them, but it is a kind of criteria. The original liberal, whatever, groups have this point of generalization, and they avoid, as David has mentioned, the hate speech. But it's now the consequence also that the radical leftist group would also have to be excluded from the civil society in these terms. And this is the whole shift of the agenda of the landscape in which we live. That has to be taken into account. We didn't even start, for all I know, not even in the theoretical discussions.
Thank you all. Unfortunately, I have to stop this panel. It has been, we're 10 minutes over and our interpreters are really tired. And I take this opportunity to thank them very much for this extensive work. And I would also like to thank all of you, as well as our guests from the audience. for bearing today with us. It has been a difficult year for everyone. And allow me for also personal comment, particularly for your ears, David. We will not give up because it is in our nature. We are determined. We know empathy. But we need support. We need European Union to tell our governments that they must not give up on transitional justice because it is a priority and it is very much a European value. It is what Willy Brandt stood for. It is for, Professor Žarko mentioned German and French textbooks, what they stand for. It is very much what being a European citizen is about. And we are doing our best. We're struggling as much as we can, working extra time without really necessary support to live up. And I admire also the organizers of this forum. It's a 13th forum. We've been grouping since 2006. Thank you, Fund for Humanitarian Law, and thank you for all our colleagues from the coalition for bearing up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us. Please stay on for the next panel at 2 o'clock and for the third one at 10:30 tomorrow. I hope to see you there again. All the best. Good luck. Stay healthy. Bye.